Hello, welcome to the Oral History of Criminology project. We are here today in Atlanta in 2018 at the annual meeting of the American Society of Criminology. My name is Jeff Ward, and I'm here today interviewing Marv Krohn. Dr. Marv Krohn received his PhD in 1974 from Florida State University, his master's degree from University of Maryland in 1972, and his bachelor's degree from the College of Worcester in 1969. He has held appointments at Western Illinois University, the University of Iowa, the University at Albany, and currently is a professor at the University of Florida. He is an American Society of Criminology Fellow, has received a Chancellor's Award for teaching, is a Hindling Award winner, and has also received the ACJS Mentoring Award. Dr. Krohn, before you got into academia, can you tell me a little bit about what life was like before you started your career?
Well, I grew up in Bloomfield, New Jersey, and it was probably a lower middle class, working class kind of community that I grew up in. Had a somewhat ordinary childhood. There was no tremendous trauma or anything of that nature. The area was, we had two parts of Bloomfield, one which was a more upper class area, and one which was the working class area. I grew up in the working class area. And there were a number of friends and people I knew who kind of got in trouble with the law in that area. But grew up with one sibling and happy childhood.
You studied psychology initially, right, at the College of Worcester?
That's correct.
And then went into sociology with a minor in criminology at the University of Maryland. Were there any key moments that kind of led you down into criminology?
Well, I think there are two avenues that I went through to get to criminology. One was the area I grew up in, and the fact that I was always interested in those people who did get in trouble. It was kind of like a voyeur. I was not a bad boy or anything of that nature. So, but I was fascinated with those who did get in trouble. And then my 7th grade homeroom teacher, a guy by the name of Mr. Hatt, told me I was empathetic. And so after I went home and looked up what the word meant, I thought about perhaps trying to counsel people who would get into trouble. And so I had kind of an early interest in the helping professions that didn't really pan out. And that's why I majored in psychology at the College of Worcester. Unfortunately, at the College of Worcester, the primary program there was an experimental psychology program, very little in terms of counseling or anything of that nature. And so really the closest I got to delinquents were to run rats in a maze, which I was okay at, but it wasn't exactly what I wanted. So when I was ready to graduate, I had to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I decided I would go on either to a counseling psych program or to a criminology program. It happened that I went on to criminology.
Are there any kind of major influences, people who have had major influences in your school?
Other than Mr. Hatt? Sure. In my undergraduate studies, Gordon Collins was my major psych professor there, and we had to do an independent study, so that got me, which was a research project, so that got me a bit involved in the research process. And then in graduate school, the key person, there are a couple of key people. One was Charles Wilford, And I went to the University of Maryland for my master's program, not really understanding what I was going to do after I got my master's. I just didn't have any skill or anything, so I figured I'd just keep going on to school. But there I was befriended by Charles, and I finished as I was finishing my master's program, the criminologist left. This was a sociology program, and the criminologist left the Department of Sociology to form their own institute, which now obviously has grown and developed. But when they first left, it was only a master's program, and I already had my master's, so I was really kind of stuck with, again, the question of what am I going to do. I interviewed a little bit for teaching positions at two-year schools, but that didn't really work out. So Charles, at the time, was making a move from University of Maryland to Florida State University. And essentially he said, why don't you come with me? And so I did, and that's how I got to Florida State University. He was my major, well, he wasn't my official major professor at FSU because the rules were that he had to wait some time before he got graduate teaching status. So he couldn't become my chair there. So I went to Gordon Waldo, and Gordon chaired my dissertation committee and really helped substantially in terms of teaching me how to put together a research article. My first publication that I had was under the direction of Gordon and Ted Chiricos. And they had a data set which some folks might know of in terms of their deterrence research. But I took a limited part of that data set and produced an article on self-report methodology under really their guidance. And between Gordon's attention to detail and Ted's writing, I think I learned how to craft an article. So it was really, I think, at that stage, and at the stage of my graduate education, was really Charles and Gordon and Ted that really were influential. Ron Akers was also at Florida State at the time, and I didn't have much association. He was on my dissertation committee. I don't think I took a class from him there, but I did get to know him. And coming out of graduate school, I had a difficult time finding a job. So I ended up at Western Illinois University, in beautiful downtown Macomb, Illinois. And it was a primarily teaching institution at the time. And I had a good year there, but it wasn't what I had been trained to do and what I was hoping to do. When I left FSU, Ron left FSU as well and went to the University of Iowa. So happened that they had a position open the following year. I interviewed for the position. I got the job, and I went to the University of Iowa. And certainly, so Ron had a huge impact on my subsequent career.
Yeah, your students know how amazing of a mentor you are, and how important it is to their development. I know you maintain contact with Ron Akers and Gordon Waldo for decades. How important has that been to you to remain in contact with them over all these years?
Well, Ron and I ended up ended up at the University of Florida together as colleagues. He left the University of Iowa after a few years there. I stayed there for about 10 years before I left, and he moved down to the University of Florida. And so happened that 10 years ago, I got an offer from the University of Florida to go down there and again be a colleague of Ron. But in between that period of time, we certainly communicated. There was a period of time when we were still publishing together off of the Boys Town research project that obviously we stayed in contact for that. And every once in a while, I would reach out to Ron to get advice on one thing or another, whether it be how to negotiate something in the department, or indeed send him some of the work that I might have done and get comments on it. And he was always as gracious as you well know in terms of helping people out. So that was really important. Gordon, I didn't have that much of a professional relationship over the years. It was more friendship. Subsequent, I mean, we didn't work in the same area. I wasn't on a research project with Gordon as I was with Ron. So it was more just him making sure that I didn't get arrested or anything of that nature over the years. And it wasn't really till I moved down to Florida that I really began to see Gordon quite a bit, and to be able to express my appreciation for what he taught me and how he really learned. I mean, I learned how to craft under him. Charles Welford and I, again, didn't really have a continuing professional relationship, although he did try to hire me at one point in time, but that didn't work out. We've always had kind of a professional relationship in the sense of I would see him at these meetings, and we'd always spend a period of time at the meetings, catching up, both in terms of our respective families and what we were doing professionally.
Great. So we learned a little bit about your the mentorship you received, and so I'd like to talk a little bit about your research. In particular, what are some of the kind of major themes of your research?
Major themes. Clearly I started off being interested in juvenile delinquency, and that was kind of the beginning point. Given that interest, I got into self-report methodology very early on with my work with Gordon and Ted. And from there, when Ron, I was fortunate to get hired at the University of Iowa and renew my association with Acres. It was at the time that Boys Town basically gave him a blank check to do research on something. And so, he was interested in doing a self-report study of delinquency and drug use and his social learning theory. And he brought me on board as part of the research team to go out to Omaha and conduct that research. Focusing on both social learning theory and social control theory, I think those were the two prominent theories that we were able to assess in that study. Got me initially into the social psychological kinds of perspectives that I think I pursued since that time. From there, I got involved in the Rochester Youth Development Study and have been working on that for most of my life. And again, it's more self-report methodology. And focusing on theories that might not be social learning and social control theories, but some sort of combination thereof in terms of expanding the project from a longitudinal panel study to an intergenerational longitudinal panel study. But it's all kind of the same theoretical and methodological basis.
Can you talk a little bit about your Web of Conformity network paper from 1986?
Sure, sure. That was a paper that I was particularly proud of. I don't think it's gotten the recognition. We all say this, but it hasn't gotten the recognition that I think it deserved. But the reason I really like that particular article is how it came about. I was on a sabbatical year at the University of Iowa, and there what they did was they had a separate building about 3 miles from the main campus. And people on sabbatical, if they weren't going out of town around the country, would get assigned an office over there. The office had no phone in it. It was before the day of cell phones. And so the only way people could get in touch with you was to go through the secretary. They had a secretary. And if your wife called and you had some sort of emergency, they would come down and knock on your door, and then you take the phone call. So basically, it was the old style notion of renewing your intellectual pursuits by just focusing on those pursuits. And it was just a fantastic time for me, because I got to read and think about things without I had an ongoing research project so that I could maintain my productivity, but the majority of my time was reading, and reading things in more depth than I had before. I had been familiar, say, with the works of Durkheim, but that year I really got to study the works of Durkheim. And from that, somehow or other, I was referred to other literature, which got me into the anthropological literature on social network, which is where that approach really emerged from. And one of the things that I had hoped to do during that year was to think about how to integrate social learning theory and social control theory, and doing it at the more abstract level, in a way that would circumvent the assumptive differences between the two theories. And I thought when I read the social network stuff that might be an avenue by which to do that. It seemed to me that the language of social network theory in terms of the impact networks have on individuals was more of a constraint type of language, so it brought the social control area into, but obviously it was dealing very much with interactions, which brought the social learning aspect into it. So I thought it was a good avenue by which to do that. In addition, part of the social network perspective suggests that it matters in terms of the arenas in which those networks exist. So you got more of the individual to group kind of relationship that social control theory talks about. So I thought it was a good way to try to integrate the two theories, avoiding those assumptive differences to the extent possible. And the outcome of it was, I think, a theory that to me makes sense. It has to other people, and particularly what it waited for. This was an article in 1986, but what it waited for really was the generation of social network data. And that's what we really didn't have to deal with. Certainly the Boys Town Project had no social network data. The Rochester Project had a limited amount. I tried to insert it into that project, but the Internal Review Board got in the way. So we really couldn't get the quality social network data that we were hoping to get, but we got some, and we produced a couple of articles from it. But it really weighted things like the ad health, which has, pretty decent social network data. And now there are other data sets that are emerging, and there's a lot of people now incorporating some social network kind of analysis. I just am actually commenting on a paper here at these meetings on labeling theory in social networks, and it's really a really interesting analysis by Wade Jacobson. In any event, so it took a while before I think the network approach really had an impact on the field, and in that process, I think people forget about the 1986 article, but that's all right. But again, it was both the process, I think, and the outcome that I really enjoyed about that particular piece.
Yeah, you have an amazing, long, sustained career making important contributions to the discipline. Are there other papers that you're particularly proud of, or other contributions that are important or kind of special to you?
Well, sure. Let me talk about areas, three areas in particular that I think are particularly important, at least in my mind. One is the general work on the Rochester Youth Development Study. I know it's not an article, but it certainly has produced a lot. And it was one of the first really longitudinal panel studies. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the initial ones. And the work on that, I think, is important not only for what we've produced out of it, but from what other people have produced out of it. And we've had a lot of PhDs, dissertations done from the Rochester data. We have a whole new generation working with those data. And so the data set itself, I think, is really kind of fascinating. It's now a 3-generational longitudinal panel study, and there are others, but this is one of them that we're very proud of. And let me give a due course to Terry Thornberry, who really is the principal investigator, was the principal investigator throughout those years on the project, and he brought me on board on that project. And I should have mentioned it earlier about significant influences on my career. Clearly, he had probably the most significant influence, more as a colleague than a mentor, but certainly getting onto that project was quite important. In getting on that project, I think one of the areas that I think we've done very good work on is certainly the gang area, and that was what we received the book that we produced on that. We got the Hinterland Award for, but there were other pieces, and one of the pieces I hate to mention this in front of you that I'm particularly proud of is the work that you and I did together on I can't remember the title, but the cascading effects of gang membership, which really, in a sense, took into account that longitudinal aspect of the Rochester data. It demonstrated, I think, quite clearly how any sort of membership in gangs really had effects not only on current delinquency, not only on future delinquency, but also life course kinds of issues. And I think that's an important piece, as well as the book itself on gangs. The other area that emerged, I think, later in terms of my interest, well, I have a very, very early article on it, is the labeling approach. And I've done a series of studies with graduate students, including yourself, on aspects of labeling theory with, again, the Rochester data. And it's a very good data set to look with. And the reason I'm proud of that research is because I think it's important. It's important in terms of countering the over-criminalization, particularly of juveniles, important in countering the Get Tough policy, and it demonstrates the collateral consequences of those kinds of policies. I think it makes an important statement. I'm pleased with the work that we've done in that area. I guess another area is just in general the whole notion of theoretical development. And I've worked quite closely with Terry Thornberry after I got on the Rochester project on developing his theory, his interactional theory, to where we could apply it to the aspects of the life course that we were beginning to collect data on. Again, both of us, I think, were mainly focused on delinquency at one period of time, certainly, and then as our sample got older, we had to adjust our theory to account for what was happening as they went into adulthood. And then when we became an intergenerational study and got that third generation of individuals, we then had to figure out what's happening with kids, with very young kids, which neither of us had really dealt with in our research. So we had to expand that theory that he initially came up with to deal with different developmental stages. And so my work on that, I'm also pleased with.
I guess in terms of, we talked a little bit about your work in the areas that you've done. What are some of the identifying kind of characteristics of the work, just general? Like what kind of defines you as a scholar and kind of marks of your work?
I don't know. I mean, I know what I'd like to think, but I don't know if it's true. I think we pay attention to methodological issues. I think we try, all of our work tends to be couched in one theory or another and is very theoretically informed and hopefully informative to theoretical issues. Although I'm not responsible necessarily for it, I think a lot of the work has used what the cutting edge analytical tools might be at the time. And in some cases I think that's been good, in some cases it's been not so good. But we've tried to incorporate what we thought, at least at the time, was the way to go about analyzing the data.
So let's just switch for a minute to talk a little bit about teaching, if that's okay. Can you describe a little bit your approach to teaching?
You could probably do a better job on that than I can on that. There's two levels of teaching, obviously. One is the undergraduate, one's the graduate level, and I think I have two different approaches to the two different levels. I think at the undergraduate level, I usually teach large section classes of clearly over 75, usually up to 150, and in some cases I've taught 300. And so in those classes, I think the key to effective teaching is your own enthusiasm, because you're really just performing in a sense in front of them, and personalization. I think that's really necessary when you're trying to, say, teach a theoretical concept to a class of 75 students or whatever. You're not going to have a conversation necessarily with them, even though you try to solicit interaction, stuff like that. We all know that's somewhat difficult to do. And so you have to demonstrate how that information is personally relevant to them, and the best way I think to do that is to talk about how that information has been personally relevant to yourself. So in talking about, say, a theoretical concept, if I can, I relate it to an experience that I've had throughout my own youth, or that my kids have had. They give me a lot of material, trust me, in terms of their misbehavior and involvement with the legal system. So if you can do that, then the students, I think, will remember the story, in a sense, and they'll be able to relate that back to the concept. So that's what I do, I think, on the undergraduate level. On the graduate level, it's much more of a conversation and personal mentorship. I think that almost all graduate students, if not all graduate students, have the potential to make contributions to the field, and I try to convey that to them by allowing them to, in a sense, self-actualize what I think their potential is. And it's not, it's you might describe it as kind of a tough love. I don't think I go easy on people who I think are good. Did I go easy on you? But on the other hand, I hope at least that I encourage them sufficiently so that they convince themselves they can do it. I think that what holds some people back is the questioning of whether or not they can actually make a contribution to the field. And, almost all the graduate students I've worked with, I thought at least that they could make a contribution. Some of them did not think that. And so, my job is to help them demonstrate to themselves that they can do that. So, that's my mission, I guess, on the graduate level. Does that answer your question?
That's great. Yeah, and just in talking a little bit more about mentoring, your mentorship has meant the world to me personally. And I could line up all of your students, and they would say the same thing, invariably. What do you think have been some of the reasons in which you've been able to be such an effective mentor to so many people?
I'm a nice guy. No, I think it's because of my own need and interest in interacting with people. This is oftentimes illustrated with people trying to convince me to do online courses. That's not why I got into the profession. I want to have this kind of personal interaction with students, and that's why I like graduate education so much. It's not that I dislike undergraduate education, but it's a different process, at least for me, because I teach these large section classes. But on the graduate level, I get to know you. I get to know your kids. I get to know your wife. I get to know things about you, and in that process, what I hope happens is that graduate students understand that I'm invested in them. I'm not invested in you making me rich and famous, although I'd appreciate if you did. Okay, I'm invested in you as a person. And if I can convey that, okay, and then if on top of that, I can demonstrate to them how they can demonstrate to me that they're really competent, we've got success. And so that's what I try to do. Now, you would have to be the judge of whether I do that effectively.
Certainly, yeah, there's no doubt about it. What's some advice that you would give to young scholars coming out these days?
Think more, do less. quite frankly. And what I mean by that is that I think we've gotten overwhelmed with the tyranny of metrics. That's a title from an article that I've read in the last couple of years. But, you know, everybody complains about it, but we haven't done a thing about it, really. You know, we are so concerned with having, you know, 3 a year in order to get tenure, with having X in order to get a salary increase, and in order to have so many pieces of work that we can get to be a full professor, etc. And we have become obsessed, I think, with that as a profession. And what that does, and I'm guilty of it too, so I'm not criticizing other people. You know, clearly I've been involved with that. I've benefited from it, and so there's no doubt about that. But what it's done is it's taken away a lot of opportunities for me to think about things. You know, I you know, gave the illustration of that sabbatical time. You know, if I had spent the other 3 sabbaticals I've had over the course of my career doing the same thing, I would have been a lot happier of a scholar. I didn't, you know, the other 3 were much more goal-oriented. Okay, we had to produce this, we had to produce that, and etc. And I lost that opportunity to really be a scholar. And I think so many of our young people are doing the same. And I understand the constraints put on us by the profession, but we're the profession. You know, in a sense, we're the profession. If we this is idealistic, but if we collectively redefined what it meant to be an academic, what it meant to be a scholar, okay, we might be able to get that across. But we have to be willing to step back and think about the stuff we're studying, think about, you know, the literature we're reading, more than just producing that next piece that's going to be published that's, you know, going to have an impact factor score, and that's going to, you know, give us a salary increase or whatever. And I think, you know, when you get to my age and you reflect back on your career, if you folks continue on the way you're going, okay, you're going to feel like I do, in the sense that you missed opportunities to really be a scholar.
It's pretty profound. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there. Looking back, you know, hindsight's 20/20. So just want to talk a little bit about the Rochester project. And is there anything that, if you were able to kind of go back in time and redo certain things or add in elements to the project or something, is there anything that you would do differently?
Well, one pops up immediately, and that is we had made a decision. The charge of OHCP was to study serious delinquents. A lot of the research up until that time had focused on general middle-class school populations where you didn't get a distribution that went into the serious delinquency kind of category. And so they charged the 3 sister projects, Rochester, Denver, and Pittsburgh, with the mission of really focusing on getting a sample that had serious delinquents in it. And in that, in order to address that concern from OHCP, one of the decisions we made was to oversample males. Okay, so our sample was 75% male, 25% female. What that meant basically is when we try to do analyses on females, we run out of cases when you begin to look at the distribution among, you know, the races and the different ethnicities and stuff like that. So I forget exactly how many. We have very few white females in our sample, so you can't compare, say, white females with females of another race or ethnicity. And it's a limitation. And so if we had to do it over again, we would have probably not done, you know, if anything, we would increase the sample size so that we would have a sufficient number of females in the sample. So that's one obvious thing. Another thing would be victimization data. We don't ask questions on victimization, and that was limiting. There are a lot of interesting issues that one can do in terms of offending and victimization and all the theoretical kinds of work that we can't address because we don't have the victimization data. The other things I think were limitations of that project were probably more because of resources, and we did spend a hell of a lot of money, or we're spending, I guess, it's still going on, a lot of money on the project, but you always seem to want more and need more in order to get more information. But I guess that's about it.
Right. Yeah, so I just want to kind of preface this last question with, you're not allowed to retire, but what are you looking forward to when you decide to retire?
Well, a number of things. I'm not sure when I'm going to retire.
Right.
But I look, well, in terms of recreation. As you know, I'm a beach person. The thing I do best in life is tan. So I will certainly do some of that. But other than that, I think thinking, again, the theme that I just spoke about, I'll have more opportunity to actually think about things, and in conjunction with that, reading, just because I'm interested in reading something and not because I have to incorporate it in the next research piece that I produce. So I'm looking forward to that, and then I've got grandchildren, so that will be on the agenda as well.
Well, thank you for sitting down with me and having this conversation. Appreciate it.
Welcome. Thank you.